Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, so I'm really excited to present some of the work that we conducted in our lab in Göttingen on children's word learning under uncertainty. Okay, so what we know is that within their first years of life, children become remarkable language learners. So they learn several new words a day, and this is really impressive given the fact that they are surrounded by uncertainty. So one of the major problems that they are facing is called the problem of referential ambiguity. So when they hear a new word for the first time, like the word papaya, their environments offer a huge hypothesis space of potential reference. And so the question then is, how do they learn these words despite this whole uncertainty surrounding them? And one piece of the puzzle is that children learn their words in very rich social settings. So that means we communicate in social interactions to bring about different kinds of social goals, and it is within these social interactions that children learn the words of their language. And today I want to talk about a set of studies on how children can make use of this social context to learn novel words under uncertainty. And I want to argue that they can do so by using a set of skills. So they can use the social context to make inferences about the intentions of a speaker who's using a novel word. And this includes abilities that I will refer to as inferential and social pragmatic skills. And I will focus on these in the first part of the talk. And then I want to show that whenever children are facing uncertainty in the learning process, they may be able to recognize this uncertainty. And then they can actively try to reduce it themselves, for example, by seeking information from the people around them. And this relates to children's metacognitive skills that I will focus on in the second part of the talk. So starting with the first part, there's a bunch of research showing how children can use their inferential and their pragmatic skills to understand new words in the social context. And one way to do so is by using common ground. So common ground is any kind of knowledge that is shared with the conversation partner, and there are different kinds of common ground that children can use. So first of all, children can consider the shared knowledge with the language community as a whole. So basically knowledge about how words are conventionally used in their language. So for example, when they hear the word papaya, which they don't know yet, and assuming they know the word apple, they can exclude the apple as a rather implausible referent because we usually expect others to use conventional words for things. So she would have said apple if she meant the apple. And this selection of the novel object instead of the known one in this context is also called the mutual exclusivity effect. But now this example here requires that children can already rely on some existing word knowledge. But now even in cases in which they can't do so, they can still consider another kind of common ground, namely common ground with their specific conversation partner. And one example for that is children's understanding of discourse novelty. So for example, if somebody is using a novel word really excitedly, like in this example here, children can infer that it's more probable that she got excited about something that is new in their discourse, like the blue object in this case, rather than something that is already established in their common ground, for example, because they've played with it before. And now examples like these here have been taken to show how children use their inferential and their social pragmatic skills to learn novel words. But now there's been a debate, especially with associative word learning accounts, about in how far their behavior could be reduced to simpler processes. For example, in both of these effects, it could be that children simply select the novel object because they're attracted to its novelty. And that's why in the first two studies I want to present, we looked at exactly these two effects in more detail. So these are studies together with my supervisor, Tanya Behne, and with Friederike Contier. And so in the first study, we looked at the mutual exclusivity task in more detail. So we tested 2- and 3-year-old children, and we presented them with two objects. One was completely novel, the blue one here, and one was a well-known object, like the car. And then when the speaker, the bear here, asked for a novel label, like the Modi, then we found that children reliably selected the novel object as the correct referent. So this was what we expected, but now we wanted to show that this was actually an inferential process and that it was not guided by the simple fact that children were attracted to the novelty of this object. So what we did is that we presented a novelty control condition to show that if the only thing that differs between these two objects is their relative novelty, but without any lexical or pragmatic context, then this should not be sufficient to evoke the same behavior in children. And so we showed two unknown objects that only differed in their relative novelty. So one of them was completely novel, the blue object again, and while the other one has been pre-exposed to children earlier in the experiment. And we found, as you can see here in blue in the graph, that children did not select the most novel object in this case as the referent, but instead they picked objects randomly. But now to look a bit closer into the inference that they actually made here, we coded their looking patterns, and we looked for signs of reasoning by exclusion inferences, and that's something that has been called double checks before. So in line with these double checks, we found that if children happen to look at the novel object while the speaker was labeling the modi, they would quickly look at the car in order to exclude it, and then they looked back to the novel object before they selected it. So overall, what this suggests in study 1 is that children do not directly map a novel word to a novel object, but that they can reason by exclusion, so they can actually use their inferential skills to learn novel words from the social context in situations like these. And then in the second study, we followed a very similar approach to look a bit closer into the discourse novelty task. So here at the beginning of the task, only one object was present, and the speaker and the child jointly attended to it. So this is how that looked like. I hope the sound works.
Ah, schau dir mal das an. Hier ist nichts.
So afterwards, the pink object here was already established in their common ground, and then later when in the absence of the bear, the second object appeared, the blue one, and when the bear then came back and got really excited about the modi, we can infer that he's probably excited about the object that is new in their discourse. And so we again found also in this task that children found the referent here very reliably, almost at ceiling. But similar as in study 1, we again introduced such a novelty control condition and found that if the pragmatic context was missing, then children did not select the most novel object as the referent, but they again picked objects randomly, as you can see here in blue. So this means for both of these cases that children actually seem to use their inferential and their social pragmatic skills to understand novel words in the social context. Okay, but now sometimes there may be cases in which children cannot make use of these skills that I just introduced simply because the context does not provide sufficient information for them. And this is where another area of skills becomes very important, namely their metacognitive skills. Or in the broadest sense here, I mean skills that allow children to monitor or to respond to their own uncertainty. And I want to focus on two specific skills in this context. So first of all, when children are confronted with ambiguity, they can actively try to reduce it themselves, for example, via social information seeking. So this can mean either looking to the speaker to gain more social information, but it can also mean explicitly asking for more information when it's needed. Oh, sorry. Okay, and here it has been found that already 2-year-olds do actually respond to referential ambiguity by looking to the speaker more often and by seeking more information. But actually there's surprisingly little research on this topic, especially in the word learning domain, and at least to my knowledge there's no research at all on whether children are explicitly aware of their own uncertainty in situations like these. And the second example I want to focus on concerns the way that children treat words that were learned in uncertainty, or specifically how they update information that was learned in uncertainty. So when they learn a new word in a very uncertain context, such as here on the left, then it's usually a good idea to treat this information with caution. So here we cannot be completely sure that the blue object is named Gazelle, for example. But when we then get new information later in time, for example, because somebody is naming the object very clearly, a Mido, then we should update what we've learned before. But in the end, to use uncertainty in this way, you first have to recognize the uncertainty in the scene. And that's why in an ongoing project, we looked at exactly this. So we asked, first of all, do children recognize their own uncertainty during referential ambiguity? And can they maybe even use this information to both systematically seek more information when it's needed, but also to update word-object links that were learned in uncertainty? Okay, so this is an unpublished study in which we tested preschoolers, 4- and 5-year-olds, but also adults on their ability to recognize their own uncertainty during word learning and to act on it, which means, for example, seeking information when it's needed. And the main manipulation was that we presented tasks with different levels of referential ambiguity within subjects. So we had 5 task types with increasing ambiguity, here from the left to the right. And so starting with the easiest ones in the familiar label trials, we presented 1 or 2 familiar objects and we asked for a familiar label. So here there was no ambiguity at all involved, so basically this was our baseline. Then similarly in the unambiguous trials, there was no ambiguity because we asked for a novel label but in presence of 2 novel objects. Then we included mutual exclusivity trials that involved already a bit more of ambiguity. And finally, in the ambiguous trials, we had the highest level of ambiguity. So we presented 2 novel objects and we asked for a novel label, which means that children basically had to guess which one was the right one. And what we tested was whether with increasing ambiguity, children would show increased markers of uncertainty and whether they would increase their information seeking. And we looked at both of these in an implicit but also an explicit way. So as an implicit marker of uncertainty, we measured their response times, and we found, as expected, that the higher the ambiguity in the task, so from left to right here, the longer they hesitated before they made a choice. But now in the next step, we were even more interested in whether children are also explicitly aware of their own uncertainty in these cases. And for that purpose, we used this 3-point confidence scale. So after children selected a referent in each task, children had to indicate whether they were really sure that their answer was right, only kind of sure, or not so sure. And what we found was that children were generally overconfident, so they reported relatively high certainty across all of these contexts. So higher values here show higher confidence. And this actually fits to the literature on their overconfidence at this age. But what was important is that still their judgments were sensitive to the ambiguity of the task. So with increasing ambiguity, they reported less certainty in their choices. So it seemed like they were actually aware of their own uncertainty to a certain degree in these tasks. Okay, and finally we measured whether their uncertainty would also evoke more information seeking. And here I can keep it short, basically. So the higher the ambiguity in the task, the more likely it was that children were actively seeking more information. And they did so both implicitly here on the left side by looking to the experimenter more often to gain more social information, but also explicitly on the right side by asking more questions to the experimenter. So overall, it seemed like they recognized the uncertainty in the task and they tried to resolve it actively in many ways. Okay, so this was the first part of the experiment, but then in the second part, we went one step further and we were wondering how they would treat the information that was learned in uncertainty, or more specifically, whether they would update words later on depending on their initial learning context. And the setup looked like that. So after, for example, we presented a mutual exclusivity task and an ambiguous task, we would present the two objects again that they've selected here. So I don't know if you can see. You can see the mouse maybe. So the idea was if they were really sure, or if they selected the object that was framed in yellow here and the object that was framed in red here, then we would present these two objects again later on, and we would provide a conflict by providing a completely novel label for it later on. And the idea was if children were really sure that this one here is called a Modi, but they were not so sure that this one here is called a Toma because they had to guess, then they should be more likely or more willing to update the second object later on. And so based on this idea, we created two types of conflicts. And so we tested the updating of words learned in a mutual exclusivity task compared to a more ambiguous task, but also compared to a less ambiguous task. And regarding the results, I'll start with the good news first, which is that adults as a validation group did what we expected. So they updated words that were learned in more uncertainty, but children actually did not show this behavior. But they did something else that was really systematic. So children just updated whichever label they learned first, so regardless of its learning context. And we think that one possibility of what's going on here is that because the updating task was directly presented after the other trials, it might be that the last mapping was still in their working memory, and this could have interfered with the updating task. And that's something we're currently following up on. So in an ongoing project, we are now presenting children with an adapted version of the updating task. So we are introducing a stronger conflict by comparing the extremes of words learned in completely unambiguous settings and in completely ambiguous settings. And then we are testing their updating only after a filler trial, which should prevent that their last mapping was still in their working memory. And I cannot report on any children's data yet, but we just tested 90 adults in the task, and we found that they performed almost at ceiling, even better than in the previous version of the task. So we're now really excited to see how preschoolers will behave. Okay, so I started all of this with the question, how do children learn words under uncertainty? And I'm coming back to the idea from the beginning that one important answer is that children learn their language in very rich social settings. And within these settings, they can use a set of skills to learn words. They can use their inferential and their social pragmatic skills to infer a speaker's intentions who is using a novel word, for example, by considering the common ground with her. And they can use their metacognitive skills to recognize the uncertainty in the scene, and they can actively try to reduce it, for example, by seeking information when it's needed. And with that, I would like to thank you and so many people that don't fit on the slide for their support in this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie, for the talk. And now, please raise your questions. We have 5 minutes to ask Natalie.
Thank you very much. I obviously like this work. It's very interesting. We have done some work too. But I always have this doubt about the relevance of this kind of work to actual word learning, because I think they are very relevant for highlighting the phenomena that you are highlighting. For example, the use of metacognitive skills, the use of reasoning in this kind of task. But there is this issue that people always come up with, which is, you just go around, and there is never like a binomial decision that you need to take about words. There is a lot of mess. There is never like and so I wonder how confident you are that these kind of results, which tell a lot about children's cognitive abilities, that I grant for sure, they also tell something really important for word learning. And I wonder how you could actually test these kind of things. And there are ways to test, and I wonder if so, for example, suppose you just exposed kids to this kind of thing, and then like 1 month after you just gave them a story in which inside there is an actual word which is included, or maybe you just make a game in which you know that they are willing to actually accept one of the labels that you introduce in this way as an actual label that is being used. So this kind of evidence that it's actually a word that is sedimented in a lexicon, that it could actually enter, I think is still missing, and I wonder whether, what's your take on it?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So I think you're especially referring probably to the first 2 studies that I presented. So I think you're right in that these are artificial situations in which we put children, and that it's rarely the case that they are like presented with 2 objects. They can clearly exclude one of them or something like that. But I think these skills that children show here might be relevant in everyday situations where they can actually exclude some of the reference in their environment, or they can actually use things like discourse novelty, so the pragmatic context of what have we been talking about, what do you like, what, I don't know, these kind of information to find out what somebody is talking about. So I think these skills are actually relevant. And I think, so regarding the second part that you were talking about, we were also looking at, maybe that goes in that direction, at children's retention of the words afterwards. So so what I presented was only the disambiguation in the moment. Somebody was using a novel label, and we looked at how they find the referent, but we actually also looked at their word retention. So we tested whether they would remember these words 5 minutes later, which already requires that they should retrieve them from their working memory. And we found that in these cases in which they could use the social context, so both in the multi-exclusivity task, but also in the discourse novelty task, they remembered the words above chance afterwards. So it seemed like they actually learned them, at least after a delay of 5 minutes, whereas in the other situations, like the novelty in the control condition, where they had no social or pragmatic context, there was rather a mixed pattern. So sometimes they remembered them, and in other studies they did not.
Can I follow up?
One more question. We have time for one more question? Yes.
No, okay, that's fine, but 5 minutes is not very much. It just doesn't distinguish anything. So I think that one of the ways in which you could really go ahead is to test really retention at a very long distance, and there are memory studies that you can take as a point of view, but especially what you should be doing. So there is this theory of word learning that, for example, Lila Gleitman proposed, which is called this propose but verify theory, in which you really don't go into these processes, but you really need a very clear ostensive situation in which you don't go through this, but there is like eye gaze contingency, and then that is something for which the kid projects an hypothesis. That's the meaning of this, and they hold on to this hypothesis up to the moment in which the evidence obliges them to just throw it away. So one good thing that I think would be very interesting for everybody would be to just take a normal mutual exclusivity case, a case in which you really have very clear ostensive cues that determine the identification of a word, and then you test a month later. I think that would be really telling with respect to this kind of literature, and I would be looking forward for this kind of work.
Thanks a lot for the idea. I would love to see that as well, yeah.
Thank you very much for the speaker, Natalie.